a collaborative gathering. My name is Deborah Lynam, and this is my son, Hudson Lewer, and we are going to spend some time here with you today talking a bit about dyslexia. This is a first for us, so we do different workshops and awareness gatherings in the US quite often, but this format is new, so I hope you'll bear with us as we get comfortable with all of our technology here. So Hudson and I both live in New Jersey in the United States, and we have been advocating pretty strongly for about 5 to 6 years for dyslexia awareness and policies and legislation in our home state. Do you want to tell everyone about what grade you're in? And
yeah, so I'm in 8th grade now. I'm about to go into high school next year. And I was diagnosed with dyslexia in 1st grade, and so I've been trying to work on that.
Yeah, we've been on a long journey with this. Hudson has a brother who is now in college, and he's also dyslexic. So we have learned a lot over the last decade, and Hudson has been coming along and becoming a really great advocate for other kids as well as for himself. So I am going to share our presentation with you now. And oops, we had gone. So today we're going to talk in a very brief format about dyslexia and what educators need to know to serve those students in their classrooms really well. We could do 2 to 3 hours on this, so 45 minutes is going to be really quick. But what I do want to encourage is that you ask us as many questions as you can. The hashtag is up there, the TheEdCollabGathering #6, and we're going to be taking questions all throughout the workshop, but we will be stopping at certain points specifically to take questions. So please feel free to say hi to us and send any questions you have, because most important is for us to get you the information that you're looking for. So what we thought we would do today is put up the definition of dyslexia that has been adopted by the International Dyslexia Association all the way back in 2002. This is the definition that we advocated for in our state of New Jersey and got placed into our state education code. So today we're going to walk through that definition sentence by sentence and just explain to you what this condition is, and hopefully take questions from you and answer those, and then save a lot of time for Hudson and I to kind of share our personal stories and anecdotes with you, so you get a good feel about what it's been like doing this work over the past few years. So the first sentence, as you can see, dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurobiological in origin. So the most important thing that I can say to you about this sentence is just the understanding that dyslexia is one specific learning disability. It's not synonymous with the term specific learning disability or SLD. There are other learning disabilities like disorders of written expression, or dyscalculia, which is a math disability, or dysgraphia, which is a handwriting disability. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that affects kids in the area of reading, and there is another learning disability in the area of reading that would be called specific comprehension deficit, and that is different than dyslexia. So that, especially in the United States, we have found that that has been a real point of confusion for people, because in the US, we have some education legislation that uses the term specific learning disability as a category for qualifying for special education services within our public education system. So when a child may be identified as dyslexia, there could be some confusion about how that relates to the special education code in our country. So I just like to make sure that when we go through this definition, I explain that to everyone very clearly. So dyslexia is a specific learning disability, but a child may or may not qualify for services under that label in the United States. The next part of that definition, you see neurobiological in origin. So what does that mean? Well, For over 2 decades now, laboratories across the US and actually across the world have been collecting a lot of evidence to prove the cognitive basis for dyslexia. And they do this by using fMRI, which is, the ability to look at a living person's brain while it's performing some function, and also through anatomical brain studies, looking at the structure of a brain post-mortem and seeing what that looks like in terms of how it developed. And what they have found, and they keep finding evidence that supports this, is that dyslexia is a disorder within the language system in the brain. And a very specific subcomponent of that system is involved, and that is phonological processing. So important just to know that dyslexia is real. There's a lot of misconceptions out there, but it is a real condition. And many researchers are now finding that it's actually there from the start. And what do I mean by that? So the 2 brains that I'm showing you here on this slide, the non-dyslexic and the dyslexic brain. So when we're born with a brain that is ready to learn language. So a child will learn how to speak by being in an environment with people that are speaking a certain language, and you will pick that up, and very naturally a child will learn to speak. But that is not true for learning to read. Learning to read is something that actually needs to be explicitly taught. And it's interesting, different parts of the brain, and you're looking here at the left hemisphere of the brain, different areas of the brain that are used for different purposes early in life, maybe visual processing or language processing. They actually, the terminology that I've heard the researchers use is neuronal recycling. Those centers of the brain, once a student begins to be taught how to read, they actually start to change the function of what they do, and they become reading centers in the brain. So a lot of studies have shown that this is happening in brains where people are learning to read in typical environments, and we then develop these language centers which become reading centers in the brain. But for the dyslexic brain, they have found that that neuronal recycling is not happening, or not happening as easily. So we see this almost like neurosignature of dyslexia, and you can see that on the brain on the right, where those posterior systems in the brain are not transforming into those reading systems in the brain. So it really just proves to us that this is a condition that exists, and that we should be helping these students get their reading systems to really be functioning well. And we do that through intervention, and the earlier intervention, the better. So we'll talk more about this as we go on. One of the things that Hudson and I have found over the years as we go out and speak to school groups and families and legislators is there are so many myths and misconceptions out there about dyslexia. So we thought we would go through just a few with you here today. And I'm sorry this can't be as interactive as I would love it to be, but if you guys want to shoot out some thoughts on these questions, please do, and Caroline will share them with us. But these are some of the most profound misconceptions that we find out there. So is dyslexia rare?
No.
Hudson, what would you say about that?
Well, particularly in our family, it's not rare. We believe my uncle has it, my brother has it, probably my grandfather has it.
Wow.
It's not rare in our family, and it's actually quite common to have a learning difference or dyslexia.
That's right. So dyslexia is the most prevalent learning disability in children. In the US, we say probably about 5 to 17% of the US population is dyslexic. Those ranges vary based on researchers and what their cut scores are for looking at the reading deficit. But somewhere around maybe 10% would be a safe number to say, like, that's what we're looking at. And I always tell people, I really don't worry so much about the exact percentage or prevalence rate. It's high enough to know that we have at least one dyslexic student in every US classroom, and that should be eye-opening enough to us to really want to learn everything we can about this and help these kids learn to read and overcome their deficits. It occurs in all ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds and in both boys and girls. So no, it is not rare. Is dyslexia associated with low IQ? No, it is not. There's no correlation between dyslexia and intelligence levels or cognitive ability. Hudson has a really above average IQ. He is really a bright student and does extremely well in school. Dyslexia exists in low IQ individuals, average IQ, and even above average IQ individuals. So it's interesting that a lot of times the way that we're identifying kids for these categories of support in schools may rely on using IQ testing and a discrepancy between an IQ score and academic testing or achievement testing. And, you know, that has been debunked. There really is no correlation, and we just need to understand that it is a different, you know, way that the brain is functioning as it's learning reading skills, and it occurs across the continuum. Is dyslexia a vision problem?
No.
No. And
No.
Hudson was we were reviewing this morning, and Hudson was like, wow, I never actually even heard that myself, but I have heard it a lot. And the reason I hear it a lot is usually there's a lot of inappropriate interventions that are recommended for students with dyslexia. So it might be using a colored overlay on a paper, or eyeglasses that have tinted lenses, or kids are being sent out for vision therapy. Those are not interventions for dyslexia. Dyslexia is not primarily a vision problem. There may be some students that have some type of visual perceptual difficulty in addition to dyslexia, but that is not what dyslexia is. Dyslexia is a neurologically based deficit in the phonological component of language. It is a language-based learning disability. Is dyslexia a developmental lag which will be outgrown? How do you feel about that one, Hudson? You were diagnosed in 1st grade and now you're in 8th.
No, it's definitely not. It's something that's going to be with you for your entire life. Many people, I think the reason this is a myth is because if you get the proper, if you're taught the proper way, you can definitely grow to live with it, and it becomes less of a problem, but it does not go away anytime in your life. You can't outgrow this. It's always there.
Yes. So the point I would like to make to you is that poor readers at the end of 1st grade have a significant risk for long-term academic difficulty or failure. So we should not be waiting. You know, I've heard too many times, even in Hudson's case, we really had to push for the services that he was going to receive in school quite forcefully. Too often I hear all children learn to read at different times. Let's give it more time. Boys may be a little behind girls. Let's give him some more time. I hear a lot of those types of commentary as parents are trying to, you know, ask for services or support for their early struggling readers. And really, we need to put that thought aside, because this, you know, every child really deserves the best shot of, if they're struggling early, we should be giving them early and intensive support services. And if it happens to be a learning disability like dyslexia, it is not going to go away on its own. And you're losing very valuable intervention time if we are waiting. So the earlier we can identify and intervene, the better. And then also knowing that it's going to look different across a lifetime, as Hudson has just said. When he was in 1st and 2nd grade, it was really about decoding the words on the page. He was having a lot of difficulty just reading basic words. But now that he's in 8th grade, it's shifted. And what's your big thing now in 8th grade?
Spelling.
Yeah,
spelling.
Spelling. So it changes over a lifetime, but it's always there. Is dyslexia when students read and write backwards?
No.
Do you hear that one a lot?
Yes. Yeah. A lot of people say, oh, do you mix up the words? Do you spell it backwards? Like, what's happening there? I think that one comes from people just not understanding what dyslexia is and never being really taught that, because a lot of schools don't touch with their other students with what dyslexia is.
Yeah.
Like, not many people actually know what it is in the world.
Yeah, and because there are many dyslexics that you may see those reversals in, like people just think that's what it's all about. But actually, those reversals are pretty common for all early learners. Until about age 7, a lot of kids will be reversing or transposing their letters, and it takes them a while to figure out that, you know, like a chair, if you were to look at a chair in any position, it's always a chair. But when we learn the symbols in our alphabet or the symbols of our number system, those actually have to be in a very specific position or direction to connect to the right sound or value in numbers, right? So it takes kids a little bit of time to figure that out and get comfortable with that. So as far as those reversals go, if you're seeing them past that developmental stage, like maybe 2nd grade or age 7, if kids are continuing to do those types of things, then it can become a sign that maybe you need to look more closely at this student because it could be dyslexia. But they don't have anything to do with reading backwards or seeing anything backwards. It really has to do with sequencing, and students might have weak orthographic processing skills. So, you know, that's kind of what's going on there. So let's see. Next, we're going to be talking about some of the characteristics that we see for dyslexic individuals. And these are difficulties with, let me get I want to bring our screen back. These are difficulties with accurate and fluent word recognition and poor spelling and poor decoding. So I'm going to turn this over to Hudson now, okay? Tell me maybe some pretty common characteristics that you would say maybe people would describe of you.
Sometimes if I'm just reading out loud, I can have choppy reading or have a lot of mistakes in there, or I definitely have some, in many cases, poor spelling.
Okay.
And
so I'm going to stop you before you go too far. So the choppy reading or a lot of mistakes. So when you're hearing a student read out loud, which hopefully that's part of our instruction, we really do need to be listening to students read, particularly in those early grades, so that we can identify, you know, what types of difficulties they might be having. For dyslexic students, you will find that they are going to be making a lot of mistakes in words. Maybe they're not associating the correct sounds with some of the letters. You may see that they are really choppy because they haven't gotten to the point where that word is in their sight vocabulary, their sight recognition. So they have to decode every word and kind of go through that word every time instead of seeing it and being able to recognize it and pronounce it on sight. So I remember when you were younger and you were doing some of your reading, it would be, you know, you'd struggle through to decode one word in a sentence, and then maybe later down on the page, the same word would come up again. And it was like you'd never seen the word before and you had to start all over. So that was sort of what we're talking about when we say accurate or not fluent in your word recognition, because all of those skills that it takes to decode words, are a little weak for you. Then you mentioned spelling. I will say you are not uncommon when it comes to dyslexic students. I know it frustrates you now as an 8th grader, but spelling is one of the big areas. I think it's almost the best place where you can see students that are struggling or possibly at risk for dyslexia. So in the area of spelling, you will also see students showing evidence that they don't have good sound symbol correspondence. So they don't quite know what letters match to what sounds, and they may not be using them properly. You'll also be able to see maybe kids are spelling words accurately in terms of how you'd pronounce it, but it's not the way we spell it in our English language or whatever other language you may be assessing the child in. So that is a sign that there's something going on there in that phonological processing. They're not connecting the correct sounds to the correct letters or letter patterns. And unfortunately, that is a condition. The spelling piece is really hard to remediate, and a lot of dyslexics go on to eventually become really good readers, but spelling might be a lifelong challenge. And what else? Is there anything else you think is pretty characteristic?
Slow reading.
Slow reading, yes. When kids are younger and they have all those decoding deficits, that's slow in and of itself. But as they get older, like Hudson in 8th grade now, and he reads really well, really accurately, but you are slow. right? You're a slow reader. So we're going to talk about that more when we get back into some of the slides, why we still see that slow reading piece there. But that might be another thing that you look for, particularly if you work with middle school or higher students, kids that are a little bit older. They may have gotten some remediation or may have worked through some of the decoding deficit stuff. But if you still see them really struggling to read at a fluent pace, that could be an indicator that dyslexia is at play. So let's go back into some of our slides now. Pulling this back up. Oops, there we go. So the next part of the definition is talking about, oh, you know what? Let me take some questions before we go on. I want to see if Carolyn, if anybody wanted to ask us anything.
Yeah, we do have a question here from Kristen Patrick, and she's asking if dyslexia requires a medical diagnosis.
Oh, that's a good question. No. And we hear that often. That could actually go up on that myth slide. No, dyslexia does not require a medical diagnosis. In fact, there really is not a medical diagnosis for it. Dyslexia requires, it's a clinical diagnosis that would happen in an educational setting. So we're talking about reading specialists or school psychologists or learning specialist or a reading intervention teacher assessing a child's early literacy and phonological awareness skills. And it's through that look at how the child is developing those early skills that we would determine if a child may be at risk or not for dyslexia. And then if you find that the child is at risk, we would be looking at putting that child into an effective evidence-based intervention and monitoring their progress and growth in that intervention. And that's sort of how you start pulling out whether this is something that is a brain-based, a neurobiological issue, or there could be other reasons. And we'll talk about that actually now as we go on. Thanks, Caroline.
You're welcome.
So the difficulties are typically resulting from a deficit in what I had said earlier, the phonological component of language. And two things to remember. It's unexpected in relationship to other cognitive abilities. Remember, we said there's no correlation between dyslexia and intelligence. And it's also still present even when effective classroom instruction has been put in place. So I usually like to talk about this starting at a big perspective on there are lots of reasons for reading struggles, and dyslexia is one. But there may be individuals or young students who have cognitive impairments. So they actually have a lower IQ, a depressed IQ, which makes learning of any new skill difficult. So reading requires a lot of coordination in the different brain systems. So it would make sense that if there's a cognitive impairment, it would be a little bit harder to learn to read. There could be students who have some other type of language impairment, because remember, dyslexia or learning to read involves the language systems in our brain. So if there is some type of language problem, that could make it more difficult for a student to acquire reading skills. Some students have limited exposure to print or language in their homes or communities before they start school. So they actually start out at a disadvantage. They're behind the game. They're coming to school with less print exposure, less robust vocabulary. There are students who are learning English as a second language, and English is a deep orthography. It is a challenging language to learn to read in. So maybe those students are struggling because that it is not their native language. Many students, unfortunately, are experiencing limited educational opportunity. And this is a very nice way of saying that schools are not using evidence-based reading programs. Therefore, students are struggling to acquire some of these early phonological skills or phonics skills. And then there could be a learning disability like we talked about. Dyslexia is one of them, but there could also be a specific comprehension deficit that has to do with language comprehension problems. So there's lots of reasons why kids might be struggling to read, but if we're specifically talking about that last bullet, the learning disability and specifically the dyslexia part of it, we're talking about this area. So this is a great graphic that we use a lot at my place of employment, AIM Institute for Learning and Research. It is Scarborough's reading rope, and it shows the many strands that are woven into skilled reading. And it requires two large areas, right? Word recognition, which is phonological awareness, decoding and spelling, and the ability to recognize words by sight, meaning you are very fluent and you see a word and you can pronounce it and understand its meaning instantly. And then there's the upper strands, which are language comprehension skills. So when you find students that are struggling down here in the word recognition area, meaning they're not automatic with these skills, this is the subset of kids that we're talking about that are dyslexic. They have issues with their brains being able to use the language centers and the visual centers of the brain to do these types of reading skills. So how do you know that it's actually like that phonological deficit thing and not some of these other bullet points that we talked about, struggling to learn to read? So one experience that happened to Hudson when he was younger, which I think really can help you see the difference in some of these areas. His school used like a leveled reading program where he would get these little leveled reader books and he would practice them and he would read them and he would move up on the different levels. So he would come home all the time. I might as well tell this while we're on video. He would come home and have his leveled readers and sounded like he was doing great when he was reading those. But one day I stopped cooking dinner and really paid attention while he was reading his book. And I noticed that he was turning the pages before he was finished the sentence, or there may have been a picture of a horse on the page and he was just calling it a pony, but the word horse was what was written on the page. So I was quite concerned that maybe he really wasn't reading and he had just memorized these or something, or, using those other skills that he's really strong in, right? He has a great vocabulary. He knows how to use context clues. He has a great wealth of background knowledge because he loves going to museums and, all of this great stuff that builds up his language comprehension abilities, that he was using all of those instead of actually reading the words on the page. So what I did, and he was very angry with me for doing it as a first grader, he was really upset, but I took that same book and I typed it out on a piece of white paper and I videotaped him first reading page by page in the little book, and he did wonderfully. And then I immediately took the book out of his hands and gave him the white piece of paper, and I asked him to read those words on the page, and he could not even read the first sentence. It had completely fallen apart for him when it was out of that context of how he had been practicing it. So I sent the video to his teacher and I said, we really need to discuss this. But I feel like that story illustrates the point about the deficits in those lower strands of the reading rope, right? He was using other skills to give off the impression that he was reading, but he actually was not decoding those words on the page. And he could probably have gone quite a while in that program before we stopped to say, whoa, he's in trouble. He doesn't have the ability to recognize words. His word recognition skills are really bad. And we do see that trend. It's why we see a lot of kids get recommended for services or identified dyslexic 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. It's kind of like when they hit the wall, because all of a sudden those little leveled readers may be going away and now there's more text on a page. The words are multisyllabic. The pictures are gone. And some of those higher level skills that he may have been using aren't as helpful anymore. And now he really does need to decode the words on the page, and those skills aren't as strong as they need to be. So come back here. So that's what we're talking about when we are saying we have to be able to identify the kids that are they may have these skills up here. The language comprehension skills may be fine. They may be intact, but we need to find the kids where these skills are what is really causing them the problem. And how do we do that? We screen. Phonological awareness skills, we need to be looking at these in preschool and first grade, definitely. Those are really great predictors of later reading outcomes. So looking at rhyming and syllable, identifying syllables in words, and most importantly, phonemic awareness, being able to segment phonemes in words, and also identify and make connections between the sounds and the symbols of our alphabet. Rapid automized naming is another big indicator. This wouldn't necessarily be a skill that you would teach a child, but it's a skill that you can screen for. And this is the ability for a student to rapidly see an object or a color or a letter and give it the name of that item. You would be looking at the child's ability to read single words and also nonsense words, so made-up words. Do they actually know how to decode those? And you do these in word lists, and you do them in timed and untimed measures. You'd give surveys of phonics skills and syllable skills and seeing what the child has and doesn't have. You'd be looking at their encoding or their spelling skills through doing dictation activities. So you would dictate a word, and Hudson would have to show me how he would spell that word. You'd look at their written expression and their vocabulary, and you'd be comparing the work that they do in oral language versus written language, right? So their vocabulary when they speak may be very high and robust and really engaging, but when they go to write, they're choosing simpler, easier words. Or you would look at their ability to listen to a story, their listening comprehension, compared to when they read that story on their own. And that's one of the things that why, Hudson is a slow reader. And, when you read slowly, sometimes you lose your, comprehension ability. It's not as sharp as it needs to be. So you would be, if I was reading to Hudson, or if he uses his audiobooks, his skills are much higher than if he has to read it himself. So those are types of things that you're looking for students. And then, when we talked about that part about with effective classroom instruction, it's really hard to know why a child is struggling if there's not evidence-based instruction going on from the start, because a child may look dyslexic, but it may just be because they're not getting the types of reading instruction that they need. So Hudson, can you attest to that when you were in first and second grade? I remember you hated your reading instruction.
Oh, yeah, it was initially, without getting the proper training, it was pretty bad. The teachers didn't know what they were doing. I was being pulled out of class by another teacher who didn't know what they were doing.
Well, not that they didn't know what they were doing, but they were using a program that didn't align to, some of the phonics skills and things that you needed.
Yeah, but the teachers weren't taught in what they were teaching me either.
The program wasn't aligned to what you needed, right?
And every day for hour, 2 hours, was it? I don't know. I was pulled out of class during reading time while everybody else was reading their books, and they were just trying to keep teaching this to me. And
sorry, what did I do here?
And it just wasn't sticking because they weren't using the proper techniques, whatever. And I was lucky that I was able to then get another system that helped.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about what that system is. And actually, no, we're going to talk about this first and then come back to what the reading system is. Sorry, technology got me a little flustered there. So we talked about what dyslexia is, and then there's another piece to this definition that you need to be aware of. So there are secondary consequences that may come in addition to the dyslexia, right? So students who have problems reading the words on the page, right? Decoding, that very basic skill. If you're having that problem, you're probably not really understanding what you're reading, and you probably don't want to read very much. Would you attest to that? Yeah, you don't want to read very much because it's so labor intensive to just get through a passage. So what starts to happen is you see dyslexic students who are not receiving the proper interventions, they start to read less, and even when they are reading, they're not really understanding what they're reading. So their growth in vocabulary and background knowledge starts to slide as compared to their peers. And once that starts happening, now we're really in trouble because the problems start compounding. And even if they were to go back and then learn the decoding skills, learn those early basic foundational skills, they've lost so much time in building those higher level skills. So here we can bring back that imagery of the skilled reading rope, and where they may have started out fine up here, like Hudson was doing great in those little books without these foundational skills because he had a lot of background knowledge and his vocabulary was good and he knew how to reason and use context, things like that. If he had never learned how to decode, eventually we would have gotten to a point where these skills started to decline also because he would not be keeping up. So that is something we all have to be very aware of, that we don't want to have our dyslexic students slide into a spiral where now skills that used to be strong for them start to become weaknesses also because we didn't get to these foundational skills early enough. So it's important to, it is important to screen and identify kids early. And the reason that we do that is research tells us that the best time to give some of these types of interventions is kindergarten, first grade, when those foundational skills are what need to be built. Because remember, we're trying to get parts of the brain that are not born to be a reading center to turn into a reading center for these kids. So we want to get them early and get that intervention in place when the brain is plastic and ready to adapt and regenerate itself to be a great reading center. So Caroline, I know we have a few minutes left. Are there any questions before we finish out here?
We do have a question from, let me just look here. We do have a question about when is the best time to do a screening for dyslexia?
Oh, great. Well, here's the thing. A screening for dyslexia or a screening for early literacy skills, they're one and the same. So we really would love to see systems set up where we're screening students from preschool on. So all of those developmental skills that we should be seeing at the correct developmental time, we should have systems in place to screen kids for that. Because what you want to be on the lookout for is not that you're identifying dyslexia per se in preschool or kindergarten, but you want to get those kids on your radar that may be at risk for it so that you can get interventions in place in a timely manner. And then when you have kids in the interventions, you can learn a lot by watching how they progress in those interventions and use that data to start getting a clearer picture about whether or not this is a learning disability or there may be other reasons behind some of the struggles. So the best time to do early literacy screening or dyslexia screening is as early as possible. So we're talking kindergarten, first grade. We should have systems in place to screen all kids then.
Perfect.
Great. All right, let's just finish this out and then we'll take the last remaining questions at the end. So what do these interventions look like? And Hudson can, get on the phone with Hudson. He'll tell you all about it because how long were you in your intervention?
2 years of, what was it? 2 days a week for an hour long, and then it was an hour to get there and an hour back. So
Hudson got a lot of his services through a tutoring center, and he was in the program for about 2 years. But here's the good news. There are many good packaged reading programs out there. Many of them may say that they're derived from an approach called Orton-Gillingham or structured language approaches. There are great programs out there that school districts can kind of get off the shelf, and they have those components that the National Reading Panel would say are needed to be an evidence-based reading program. But I think more important than this idea of a packaged reading program, because teachers teach, not the program, is the teacher's knowledge base about number one, reading development. So all of that brain stuff that we started talking about, how does that develop for a child, as well as the structure of the English language or whatever language you're teaching the child to read in. So the International Dyslexia Association has a guidance document out there called the Knowledge and Practice Standards for Teachers of Reading. So ideally, I would love to see teachers becoming very familiar with these standards and really understanding all of that knowledge base, because that is sort of the standard of what a teacher needs to understand to be able to deliver the instruction to students that are struggling to read, but most specifically to those that are struggling because of dyslexia. And it's more than just phonics. I do need to say that. There's a lot that goes into these programs. It's students learning about phonological awareness, students learning about morphology, like prefixes and suffixes and word origin, spelling. So it's a lot more than just, simple phonics programs. And this is bringing back our brain slide again, because I think it's important to see what happens in the brain after one of these evidence-based reading programs are used with a child. We see that the brain starts functioning in a little bit of a different way. You can see that posterior area, that yellow area of the brain has started to see some activation. But this is what it's telling us. Although you've given this good structured literacy intervention and you've improved the child's ability to read accurately, you may still see that the students are struggling with automaticity or reading fluency. And that's kind of where you would say you are right now, right, Hudson? Reads really accurately, but he reads pretty slowly. His reading fluency is not, hasn't really normalized, but you can see why, because while we've made great changes in the brain towards a more normalized pattern, it's not the same pattern, so it takes longer. And I once had a student who described it as, her friend's brains work like a superhighway, and her brain after intervention works more like she's taking the country roads and she's stopping along the way to smell some of the roses. So it's not the most efficient. It doesn't turn into the most efficient system, but it improves greatly. So what do you do for those students who still have reading fluency issues? You're going to accommodate and level the playing field. So the best thing you can do for them is extra time and also assistive technology tools. So Hudson, you like audiobooks, right? How long have you been using audiobooks?
Forever.
Yeah,
really,
since like
really
third
long
grade.
time.
Yeah, Hudson's been using audiobook support since about third grade. He would get his intervention period separate so that he was learning all those decoding skills and things, but then he was back in general education settings for everything else, and he was on grade level and using grade level content because he had the support of audio. And he also likes this, well, when he was younger, he liked Dragon Dictation, which was the ability to speak into a product and it would type out it would dictate for him. But now you are moving away from Dragon, and now you like...
I now use, I don't know if other countries have this probably.
Yeah, Google.
Google Chrome. I have a Google Chromebook where I just use...
the dictation.
Yeah, the dictation on their
operating system.
Yeah, it's for any Google Docs I want to type into. They have a little app that you can download onto your Google Doc site or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm not good with computers. And then you can just speak into that. I feel that is a lot more, the speech to text on there is a lot better. It picks up what you're saying a lot better.
More accurately.
The reason it's also good is the Google speech to text, it picks up the words quite nicely, and this is the main reason I use it. It's a lot. Dragon Dictation is good, but it definitely makes you have to go back a lot more and make sure what you're saying.
So
is
you're
actually on the
finding
page.
that the Google speech to text is more accurate for you.
Yeah.
Great. So you want to make sure that you're investigating all of the assistive technology tools and supports that you can to help kids get over the very limited, like the little deficit that they have, so that they can access the larger world of knowledge that they need. And we're just going to close out today by saying it's really also important to build a child's self-esteem and their self-advocacy skills.
It's definitely more important. It's very important to build someone's self-advocacy skills, because if they don't, they could go for a very long time without getting the proper skills that they need to, succeed in school situations. I personally have been going to my IEP meetings for a while, and it works a lot better with me being able to be there and understanding what's going to be put in place, and them asking me, all right, what do you want? What do you not need this year? It's very helpful.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the last thing, if you saw that slide before we close out, Hudson is an excellent advocate, not only for himself, but for other kids. And he participates in a great web series called Dyslexiaville, the Super D Show, which you can find on YouTube. And for any teachers out there that have elementary age students, it's a great little, short little episodes with dyslexic students and kids with ADHD who do little skits that teach different self-advocacy skills. So I recommend you check that out, and you'll see Hudson, a younger version of Hudson. He did it a few years ago, but it's a great, last year. It's a great resource to show your class.
Can I just jump in, Deborah and Hudson? We have a question that you may have already answered from Jenny Maggie about one of her students who she's been having write poems about her dyslexia so that she could explain to her other friends. And Jenny is wondering about good ways to help students explain to other students about dyslexia.
I just generally like to say, if you want to go more in depth, you can tell them about everything that's going on in your brain. But if you don't want to go that far, a very simple way to explain it is, I learn differently, but I'm not weird or anything. It's just my brain takes a longer time to learn something than maybe you do because of some neurological stuff.
Yeah, excellent.
That's all from Twitter.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. We really enjoyed our time today. And you can find me also on Twitter. The hashtag is just my name, Deborah Lynam.
Perfect. And just before we close out, a big thank you to Hudson and Deborah. Hudson, thank you so much.
The Twitter feed. He's checking.
Yes, but Twitter, there's so much Hudson love going on Twitter right now because teachers are loving learning from you and your mom today. Thank you so much for all the great advice and information. Some new, some some helping us redirect our thoughts. So thank you so much for that. Before we end today's session, I want to make sure that you do continue to stay with us. And I want to tell you what's coming up in our next sessions. We have workshop number 7 by Mag Beatty Roberts talking about the power of story and helping students take risks and see themselves in curriculum. We also have Joseph Teague talking about vocabulary and using vocabulary in independent reading and writing. And then we are ending with Aubrey and Caitlin Commons talking about using technology for inquiry-based learning. So I hope you do stay with us for that. But in the meantime, one more thank you to Hudson and Deborah Lineman. Thanks for the talk on dyslexia. Everything is going to be on YouTube on the EdCollab site. So if you need to go back to that information and go back to those resources, it is there for you all. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Caroline.
Bye.